Welcome to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, your host as always. And normally I just jump right into it, but I thought this time I would say a little bit about what this podcast is about in case this is your first time listening. And I got a nice little description from this site. What is it? Podranker.com. It ranks me as the 23rd best podcast on the philosophy podcast. I think it should be higher than that, but still I'm on the map. This is what it says. Small detours into big ideas. That's the whole premise, and it works beautifully. Each episode picks a philosophical concept and explores it through brief, focused digressions that somehow connect into something larger. Okay, I didn't really consciously intend that, but I'm glad someone found a theme for this show. So hopefully you enjoy it. Okay, so I've got 3 guests today, which is more than usual. Usually it's just 1 or sometimes 2, but today I've got 3. Let me introduce that. We're going to be talking about the concept of God and theism and its coherence or lack thereof. So that's going to be the topic. I'll say a few things about that in a moment. But first, let me introduce each of our guests. We've got first time on this podcast, Nevin Climenhaga. Did I say that correctly, Nevin?
No. Climenhaga.
Climenhaga. My apologies.
No worries.
And you're in Australia, ANU, is that right?
No, I was in Australia. Now I'm in Texas.
Now you're in Texas. Okay, where in Texas?
Yes. At Texas A&M University.
Great. Oh, great. We're not that far away.
Yep.
He used to be the leading champion for most well-published unemployed person, but then he got employed and exited that race. And now Perry and I are going for that title, I guess. So Perry Hendricks, you've been on for the Rantathon, right, Perry?
Let's see. Yes, I was on. That was a few years ago, but yeah, I was on for a couple minutes there.
That's it's good to have you on a full episode. And whereabouts are you these days?
I'm in Indiana. I have no teaching job, so whoever's watching this, please hire me.
Okay. Still on the market though?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And you do work on both. Nevin and Perry do a lot of work in philosophy of religion and other areas. And we've got Steve Kershnar. His offensiveness himself, you probably have heard, his reputation precedes him. And I don't mean that in an entirely positive way. But anyway, Steve, you're a regular on this podcast, always very stimulating. And it's good to have you on again.
Great. Well, thank you. It's great to be on the show. And it's fantastic to be with 3 awesome philosophers. So you guys are great. And it's a real pleasure and an honor to be on with you guys.
Okay. So I thought I wanted to have a discussion about the concept of God and just the coherence of theism in general, because it's I've been thinking about it. It seems to be like there's a lot of discussion about the problem of evil, but this, I think, is almost like a lot of confusion comes up, I feel like, in discussions about religion and theism, because people don't even agree necessarily on the concept of God. So I think there's certain objections that I hear from atheists, like, who created God? And I thought, well, if you just had the right concept in mind, you'd see that wouldn't be a credible objection to raise, it seems to me. And then, there are these ontological arguments that purport to show that God exists, like proceeding from just thinking about the concept of God or the idea of God. I don't find them very persuasive, but they are interesting and worth discussing. And then finally, I just do want to get clear on exactly what we mean by God as a preliminary to investigating further arguments about the existence of God. So I want to just raise this initial puzzle to kick us off. So I've heard God defined as like a 3-0 God, like a being that has a certain set of properties that just means all good, all knowing, all powerful. And that, I think, is a good definition. It's better than I don't know, just thinking it's like some Sky Daddy or something like that. But the worry I have is that why those 3 properties? Just like why those 3 in particular? Wouldn't it be better to have it unified into something that explained why those three are essential. And this is the thing where I get a little bit hung up. So there are ideas like, well, God is a supremely perfect being, or God is the greatest possible being, or something like that. And I suppose I struggle there because I'm not sure that I have that concept. Like, I'm not sure what it is that makes a being great. Like, I can understand greatness in a particular domain. Like, I know what a great chess player is, or I know what I know what greatness with regard to something in particular is. I even know what moral greatness is. But there's this idea that's like all things considered greatness, or domain independent sort of greatness, and God has greatness and all. And so I don't think I have a clear concept of that. And so basically what I struggle with is this: is you start off with this collection of properties, and I want to know what unifies it. And I haven't really heard anything that's I find very satisfying as far as that goes.
Okay, so so I think there are a number of different definitions that you could use for the term God, and I think what you see in the philosophy of religion is that you have kind of like people engaging more in an a priori project of, especially like within, like, say, Thomist philosophy, but not only within that, contemporary, like, perfect being theology. There it's common to go with something like the greatest possible being, or a maximally great being definition. And so, like in Steve's notes that he sent, and in what I've seen of Steve on the podcast circuit, some of your other conversations on this, you're often working with this notion of a maximally great being. I think that if you look at like more a posteriori natural theology, people like Richard Swinburne, it tends to be more like the triple O kind of account, like a particular kind of person, omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. And something I want to say on your question there, Spencer, about, well, what unifies these. You could also think it's like a proper name, like God is a proper name, if you like ground it in a particular religious tradition, like the Abrahamic faiths. And then I guess maybe one other possibility worth noting is something like a being that's worthy of worship. I think that's plausibly like part of the concept of God. And God is, there's like lowercase g God, right? And then there's uppercase G God, which is like the God of the monotheisms or something. But it's plausible that the idea of a God is like something worship worthy. Again, Steve, some of your work has been on this. Those kind of strike me as kind of the big options in this space. My own work has largely been in the more a posteriori side. So I tended to work more with that kind of something like the triple O. And I'm not too engaged in like the perfect being theology side of things. But to come to that then, so I think your question, Spencer, is a good one about, well, what unifies these or what connects them? And I like the way that Richard Swinburne proceeds there, because he actually doesn't make moral perfection one of his definitional attributes of God. He derives it from the things that he builds into the definition of God. So what he says is that God is a person who is omnipotent, all-powerful, can do anything logically possible, omniscient, knows everything that is possible to know, and his term for this is perfectly free. And what he means by that is that God isn't constrained, or isn't rather not constrained. God is not influenced by any kind of extra rational considerations in the way that you and I have like urges for food and sex and so on, and those motivate us. He's only motivated by like his recognition of reasons. And I think there's something nicely unified about that account in the following sense, in that you could take this idea of a person, and then, well, what are the attributes of a person? Well, a person is a thing that has at least agency, that has power, like it can do things. If a thing cannot cause changes, then it's not a person. And then it has knowledge, because that's necessary to act for reasons, so something that can like act but not on the basis of reasons, that's not a person. So you need to have knowledge to act for reasons. So you got power, you got knowledge, and then you just take those both to the maximal extent. And so that's in some ways a very simple account of a person. And then the perfectly free part is so that there's not like some extra, some like non agency thing impacting the agency, something kind of extra rational there. So I think that's kind of a nicely unified account that in some ways answers that question. And then I guess with moral perfection, then you get that as like you got a motivational internalism, that if God knows what the right thing to do is, then he's going to be motivated to do it, and there's nothing countervailing that from these kind of extra rational urges. And so then God always does the right thing, and that's how you get the moral perfection.
If you're a motivational internalist, which I'm not.
Yes.
But I like.
Well, yes, but you only need a weak form of motivational internalism. So this is I think a very weak form. If you know what the right thing to do is, then you have some motivation to do it. So it's not if you believe, then you will do it. It's not even if you know you will do it, but if you know, you have some motivation. So that's like about the weakest form of motivational internalism.
Necessarily?
I mean, plausibly, it's going to be necessary. Maybe that might depend on what you think about whether God and God's attributes are necessary. And Swinburne is kind of has odd views there. But I don't know that you need to build that in. That seems like maybe an extra question.
Okay, fair enough. That's an interesting account. Steve, you wanted to jump in here?
Sure. I agree with Nevin. I think there are these different accounts. I think the best version of the concept, or alternatively, the best conception, is that God is the greatest possible being. And I think there's two reasons to see this. Number one, I claim that's our intuition. That's by and large, although not in each and every case, but by and large how we think about God. We use other descriptions like a supreme being or a perfect being, and these seem to be synonymous with a greatest possible being. I also claim, and this is quite a controversial claim, that the three best arguments for God's existence are the cosmological argument, that is, where does the universe come from, and the fine-tuning argument, that the universe is finely tuned to produce intelligent life. I claim that these presuppose the modal ontological argument, which basically says that in virtue of his nature, God has to exist. And the modal ontological argument presupposes that God's the greatest possible being. It presupposes that in virtue of his essence, he has these features, and among these features are every great making property to a maximum degree and necessary existence. Very quickly, when we fill out the greatest possible being, I think we just mean what both you and Nevin said, or something very similar, which is that a greatest possible being is just a being who has maximal intrinsic moral value. Right? Maximal value because we mean greatness, moral value because we're interested in the sort of value that makes the universe a better place implicator, not aesthetic value or hockey value or sexual value, and then intrinsic because we're interested in comparing whether that individual exists and when he does not exist, or whether he exists necessarily as opposed to when he exists contingently. And if we don't use that formulation, it becomes very mysterious as to what we mean by the greatest possible being. So I think that's the best concept. I also think it's the best conception. But I mean, there are others out there, as Nev pointed out, people would just define it as a 3L being, or use a proper name.
Perry, thoughts?
A couple thoughts. So I was going to say another aspect in line with what Nevin was saying is something that unifies, that at least Swinburne would say unifies these properties that he's talking about, is that it's the most likely version. It's the simplest conception of God. It's what holds them together. So it has the highest prior probability. And I guess one more general comment on this is I think you can mix the a priori and a posteriori methods. Like, imagine you take like Kruse and Rasmussen's modal cosmological argument, where you have like the claim is that it's possible that there's a cause of all contingent things. So you get to this necessary concrete being. But then you can sort of use Swinburne stuff to get in play there, because you have some causal power there. The simplest amount of causal power is going to be maximal. And then from there, some philosophers, this is contentious, will think that omnipotence entails omniscience. I think Nagasawa talks about this. I think Swinburne has talked about this before as well. But if you get omnipotence and omniscience, then with motivational internalism, you're going to get moral perfection. So that's one way to sort of mix both of the methods. But I'm also fine with the way Steve talks about it. Occasionally I'm fine with things that Steve says every now and then. And it's all right that I also think it's fine to talk about God as a maximally, or the greatest possible being, or a maximally great being, or something like that.
Could I say a couple things here? So, okay, so I think I largely agree with what Perry said. The one thing I would say is, so I agree that you can certainly mix the a priori and a posteriori considerations. So when I said that I kind of associate the perfect being definition with the a priori philosophy and the triple O with the a posteriori, I'm mainly making a sociological comment. Like, here's what I see in terms of kind of different groups of philosophers and the definitions that they tend to work with. But I think that you can, and I think you should, if you're trying to look at the total evidence for and against theism, you should look at both a priori and a posteriori considerations. And I think too, Steve, I think there's definitely something to the idea that the idea of a perfect being, it's a very natural thought that, well, this is kind of what underlies and could unify whatever attributes we want to ascribe to God. I think I share some of Spencer's concerns that, well, I'm not sure this is, like the greatest to core, like not just in some domain. Like I'm not sure that makes sense. And so I don't myself want to hang my hat on that or say this is how it has to be. But I'm not closed off to it either. I'm open to the possibility that there's some way to make that work.
This isn't me wearing my skeptic hat. I just sort of don't feel like I totally grok the concept of a like a great making property like Simplicator.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the same thing goes with perfection, like perfection.
Right.
Like I want to say perfection with regard to what? And the answer, there has to be this kind of generic perfection or generic scale of perfection on which God occupies the top rung or something. And I'm just not sure I understand that. And maybe that's my fault, but I don't know. I thought like the notion of God is supposed to be something that is easily understood by people, right? I mean, especially if you've got religions where ordinary people are supposed to have a relationship with God. It seems like and then being able to know what that relationship is really important to the faith. Seems like it's
Well, I
really
don't know. I mean, I have a relationship with other people, but the concept of a person might be quite a complicated philosophical one that many people can't. I don't know that people being able to have relationships with others and them being important to their lives means that the things that they're engaging with aren't philosophically tricky to understand.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting retort. I grant you that. Yeah, you don't need to know be able to write a dissertation on personhood, but you have to know at a certain level what a person is. And so I don't know that I know at that minimal level what a most perfect being is. Although I do know some of the properties that this being is supposed to have. And so I guess I'm more comfortable just thinking of it in terms of like the three O's or this the set of essential properties and not trying to unify it anymore. But go ahead,
Do you mind
Steve.
if I just jump in there? Yeah. So one is I think you do want to unify it rather than have just a series of properties. Number one, I do think we can fill it out in terms of maximal intrinsic moral value. I mean, that tells us what sort of thing we're looking for. That might be the best conception rather than the concept, but it does seem to fill out what it is we're looking for. Second, I don't think we want to define it in terms of three O's for several reasons. Number one, it's not clear, and I want to affirmatively claim that the O's contradict each other. For example, if God is essentially omnibenevolent, he simply can't do evil. And if he can't do evil, he's not essentially omnipotent. I mean, I can do evil. If he can't do evil, then in some ways I have more powers than he does. Hence, he's not omnipotent. Second, why go with three O's rather than four? I mean, why not think omni-responsible is relevant, right? I mean, why be so stingy? That's my claim. So, if you're going to define him in terms of O's, give him four O's. But again, I think you want the flexibility to say, well, maybe it's only one O, omnibenevolent. And then third, some of the O's are just irrelevant. I mean, who cares how powerful you are in terms of your greatness? If you increase your bench press to over 400 pounds, it's not like you become a greater being in some sense that matters in and of itself. So I think we definitely do not want to define it in terms of a 3O being, again, because they're incompatible. It's stingy, and it's not clear that any of those O's should matter at all. Maximal intrinsic moral value seems to get at what we're looking for, although that might be the best conception of God rather than the concept of God.
Perry, you look like you want to get in here.
Let's see. I don't know. I mean, I'm fine with there being. I'm not So yeah, if we think about God as the greatest possible being, as Steve likes to, I don't think there's a reason to constrain it to. I don't think it's obvious that we have to constrain it to just omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness. So I'd be fine if there were a convincing case for a fourth attribute, but maybe, I mean, one reason to talk about those three is because those are three in the Swinburne, or if you're taking like a Swinburnian case, those are the three you can get. And those are the three that we know the most probable version of theism, God would have those properties. So I'd be fine if there could be a case given for a fourth one, or a fifth one, or a sixth one. I have no problems with that. And then in terms of whether the properties are incompatible, I don't know. I mean, I think that if they are incompatible, then what we need to talk about is what the maximal degree, the maximal compossible amount of the 3 O's or 4 O's or however many you want. So I think those can be relatively easy. Those kinds of words can be relatively easily resolved. I suspect Nevin's going to have a different take on this than me, though.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things. So one, I think, so in terms of why like the specific number of O's, well, of course, God has lots of properties that aren't just those three, but um, I think what we want to do is try to give as simple an account we can of the fundamental, either the fundamental attributes of God or the fundamental attributes of our hypothesis of God, and then see what we can derive from those. And so I suggested a minute ago that the way Swinburne sets it up, I think is fairly simple and has some nice unity to it in terms of like these attributes of a person. And then you get moral perfection, omnibenevolence, to use that term, out of that, but it's not one of the original three. And then he has a number of other concepts that are attributes that he also thinks follow from these. So, there might be, I don't know, there are like 9 or 10, that he ultimately ends up committing to. But you could have kind of a simple basic structure there. Yeah, so that's one thing I would say. On the question of the attributes contradicting, I mean, it's a well-worn area of perfect being theology, I guess. But I tend to think that when we say that God can do anything possible, that's not contradicted by God never essentially never doing evil, because like the sense of can there seems to be something like productive power, like God has the power to bring about any possible state of affairs. So, maybe there's a conditional truth, like if God tried to do X, then X would happen, that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that there's any possible world in which God does X if X is something that is morally wrong.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was thinking, isn't it easily avoided by just saying God can do evil and then just chooses not to? But if we've got,
Yeah, that's basically what I've said.
yeah,
I think
okay, but
one way of saying that.
it is one way of saying it. But what your way of putting it made me think that, oh, yeah, there's this issue that if you're understanding possibility or like modality in terms of possible worlds, then that would mean that there would be a possible world in which God does something bad, and we don't want that, right?
Yeah, we don't want to say that.
All right, Steve. I assume you're completely satisfied by that answer.
No, I think this is not. I mean, Nevin's ideas are all very powerful and always worth considering, but I have to respectfully disagree. I mean, this is an odd view of omnipotence, right? I mean, there's no possible world in which God does evil, and yet he's capable of doing it. I mean, we wouldn't say that's elsewhere. Imagine that Patty Hearst was manipulated and her psychology was formed essentially so that she could not do anything but support Marxist revolutionaries. She could not, in any possible world, support capitalists. And you say, oh, yeah, but Patty Hearst has the ability or the power to support capitalists, even though there's no possible world in which she does it, because why? If she had a completely different psychology, which is impossible for her, then she would support them. I don't think that's a plausible reading, and I don't know why we should have a different approach for Patty Hearst than we would have for God. So I think
mean,
that
I think the word can mean different things in different contexts. And if like you go up to a weightlifter, like suppose a weightlifter has like overriding moral reason to not lift a rock because it's, pressing down a button that's like, has like keeping some medical device functioning. And, if he lifts the rock, then this child's going to die. Okay. Well, so, suppose that like he's morally perfect. And so he's not going to lift the rock, right? Well, can he lift the rock? Well, there's a clear sense of the question, right? In which like, well, yeah, like he can lift anything up to 200 pounds. It's only 100 pounds. He can lift it. Right. And if I said like, no, he can't lift the rock. And, my reason is because of these moral considerations. Like clearly there would be a context in which it would seem like what I meant was like, he's not strong enough. But that would be misleading in that context if I said that. And I think that like the kind of thing that you're saying, Steve, is similarly misleading in the sense that you're saying, well, God isn't omnipotent because look, he can't do evil. Well, like maybe there is a sense of which like God can't do evil, but there is also a sense in which God can do evil. What is the sense of can that's operative when we say that God is omnipotent? That's how I would be thinking about this.
so. Three quick things here about Nevin's point. One is I just don't think this tracks the sort of power that we're interested in with regard to God. Imagine we ask God, about God, can he kill himself? Can he make himself evil? Can he torture humans just for the fun of it? We say, no, there's no possible world in which he can do it. In fact, he would have to have a different psychology than he currently has, but he has a psychology essentially. And you say, well, but if he had a different psychology, even though that's impossible for him, he could still do those things. I'm just not sure how that's relevant. I mean, it's not within the range of things that he can bring about. So I'm not sure what we gain by saying he's omnipotent. But second, even if that were not true, even if Nevin were correct, I'm not sure why we would think omnipotence is great making. Despite Swinburne's outstanding work, I just don't see it. I mean, when you increase your bench press, you don't have greater, intrinsic moral value. So why should we think that omnipotence is a great maker? That is, it just seems to be irrelevant. If anything, it's just an enabling condition for omnibenevolence. Third, if you thought that there were ever increasing cardinalities of an infinity, I'm not sure we should think that. But if you were to think that, then why think that God would have maximal power? You might think that there's ever larger infinities of power. So I'm not sure if we want to say that. But I guess the main consideration is, look, it doesn't track what we care about. And in any case, it's not great making.
So let me just come back on the third and the second there. So on the third, I'm not sure why we would think that that there could always be like a greater degree of power, because I think you can define omnipotence fairly simply in terms of able to do anything that's metaphysically possible, something like that. So you can do like a negative, that there's nothing possible that God cannot bring about. And now there are like tricky questions about whether like can God like bring it about that like a free agent does something that that agent could have done not to do. Well, that's possible, but maybe it's not possible for God to bring that about. Okay, there are tricky cases, but something like that seems a natural way to put it. And I don't think it's going to at least fall prey to this worry that, oh, well, you can just have like a higher cardinality or something, so there's going to be always a greater degree of power. Then on the second point of like, well, what is this? Why does this matter? I think if you let's think of for the moment in terms of like the greatest person. Well, part of being a person, part of being an agent is doing things. That's like an essential part of agency, of personhood. And so the more things you can do, then in some sense, the greater a person you are, not in like every relevant sense. And it doesn't mean you're morally better necessarily, but there's like this kind of essential feature of personhood where if you have more power to bring things about, then you're like higher on this scale of this important thing to being an agent. So it doesn't seem to me like that. And again, as I said earlier, the notion of great making, I'm not sure that there is kind of this general notion of great making or perfection, but to the extent that if I put myself in that frame of mind and get that, think about things that way, then it doesn't seem unnatural to me to include, being able to do more things.
Setting aside my general issue with the notion of great making, I don't see anything particularly absurd in thinking that you're gaining some value by being able to bench press more, you're accomplishing more. I think I do have some fuzzy notion of greatness along these lines, like being able to make a difference in the world, being able to have causal power over the environment seems like a kind of greatness. Like if there's a book about the great men of history, it's not going to be a bunch of like monks who meditated in the cave and they were super virtuous and did nothing else. Like, no, like, and I do think that like we have this sense of like it's desirable to exercise power over the world. And I feel like I see this in miniature in my kids all the time about being able to influence things, using what little strength they have to make things happen. So I'm not so worried about that point, but it does seem to me that like, why not say what Perry said and say, it's just say, okay, fine. The most extreme kind of omnipotence you can think of might be incompatible with benevolent, like the extreme good, the maximal goodness in this sense. But if we say like, okay, fine, so God can't do evil, not because of any external constraint that's stopping him, but because of his own necessary nature and a desire to do good. And that is the thing that constrains him from, I guess, if you want to describe that as a limiting factor on his power, that seems okay. That doesn't seem fundamentally, that doesn't threaten any kind of deep coherence I think the theist should be worried about.
Yeah, I think I'm happy with that move too. That'd be kind of my backup if I, didn't think that the way that I set things out worked. I liked your point, Spencer, about like the great man of history idea. There's kind of this old sense of the term great, kind of the same as like Times Person of the Year, right? Where it's like it's not like the morally best person, right? It's like the most influential, So like, yeah, great man of history or the great books or something. Like in some sense, this is like things that have had like a great influence in the world, right? And so that maybe that sense of great is part of the what we mean in this kind of greatest possible being idea.
Perry,
So
wait. I want to hear from Perry. It's been a minute.
Well, I mean, I liked what you said when you were saying you agreed with me, but I don't think I have anything to. I want to hear what Steve's about to say here.
So I think there's three reasons not to have this view that power is a great maker. Number
Poor
one,
Steve.
number one, this is like saying, well, it matters how much intrinsic and extrinsic value a world has. Extrinsic value is just value because of the intrinsic value it brings about. So it seems to be this is just a guide to like either the intrinsic value of the being or the intrinsic value of what he brings about. Second, I don't think we want to count it this way. Imagine you have a really evil individual, but he's so evil that he's an excellent role model for the rest of us to avoid. So Ted Bundy's bad example brings about an enormous amount of good. We wouldn't want to say, well, Ted Bundy has enormous amount of greatness because of the extrinsic effects he brings about. But that's what happens when you look at these sort of extrinsic properties as great makers. And third, you can imagine a being who's the penultimate best being, but his existence prevents the existence of the best being. And so therefore, he has negative overall value because but for his existence, there'd be a better being. Still, we might want to say this is a really great being. And that tells us that what we're focusing on is intrinsic value, not extrinsic value. The power to bring things about, I think, is at least in part filled out extrinsically.
Well, I think that the first part of that is fairly easily answered, because it seems to me that there are all sorts of qualities that have intrinsic value when they're combined with other qualities, but not necessarily combined with any other set of qualities. So patience, a virtue I conspicuously lack. I would be a better person if I were more patient. But take a homicidal maniac who's able to wait more patiently for his victim in the bushes or whatever, and you've got a worse being in that case, or worse person. So there are all sorts of qualities, I think, that relate to self-control that are good. Like if I imagine my concept of what the devil would be like, I don't imagine him with no good qualities. I imagine he like scheming, clever, and bold, and like Milton Satan. My next podcast is going to be on Paradise Lost, by the way. Milton Satan has a lot of qualities that make him attractive because he can cause more damage that way. That doesn't mean those qualities would not be good qualities if they were attached to a righteous person, right? Like so I think that thing about power and great making, it's like a bad making in the worst people, doesn't really derail the point.
And I'll add something here is like, I mean, I think one way to think about it would be like, imagine you have this being that is really good and really knowledgeable and has like 1,000 terps of power. Doesn't it seem that when it increases to like 10,000 terps of power, that there's some kind of improvement? Like it seems like the being, when it acquires more power, improves in some kind of way, even if only a smidge or whatever. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, when I think about cases of increasing power, it does seem like there's an improvement going on, and that's one reason to think that it would be this great making property or whatever.
One other thing. I do want to talk a bit more about the notion of worship worthiness and whether that is a key element to the concept of God, whether we can reflect on worship worthiness and thereby arrive at a clear conception of God. But it does seem odd to think that a powerless being was worship worthy. Like, I honestly, an evil God seems more worship worthy than like a pussy God or something, like an impotent God. That doesn't make any sense to me. Like, it seems like power of some kind described in a just being able to make things happen does seem like it's important here. apart from moral considerations.
Being awesome in kind of a like in a like a sense of awe, right? Like there's just
Right.
like whoa,
Right.
like having that kind of reaction that's described of like people in the Bible who like are awed by God's power, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I'd like to just cut in here on that. Notice your reasoning with regard to patience, though. I'll get to the awesomeness in a second. Patience, you say, is not a per se great maker. It's only a great maker when it's in a certain combination. Why does it matter if it's in that combination? Because it contributes to something else. What is that something else? I mean, I claim it's maximal intrinsic moral value. You might claim it's something else. But note that what you're saying is these properties are not by themselves great makers. They're in combination a great maker. Well, that seems to suggest that we're looking for what it is that the combination enables or grounds or participates. But something like patience is not itself a great maker. I'm not sure why we should treat power any different than patience. In terms of awesomeness, I think that's a great point that Nevin made, but I don't think that's what religious folk either do think or should think. I think when they worship God, they're not saying, man, are you a powerful dude? I think they're saying, look, by worshiping you, I'm expressing gratitude. And I'm expressing gratitude because you're praiseworthy for what you've given us. So I don't think that awesomeness is going to get at what religious people do or should have in terms of their attitude toward God.
Well, not on its own. I do think
Yeah.
I do think with patience, and I do think with a number of these other things, I do want to resist the move that it's that the fact that it's only good in combination with other good things means that it is purely instrumentally valuable. Because I think it is good just in my contemplating having it, right? It's hard to imagine, like, if I could choose to be a more patient person, even though it wouldn't bring me more good things or fulfill my desires, it still seems like it would be better to have the property. Although it's a little bit hard to contemplate that scenario. But I do think, and I think Michael Sloat has written about virtues that seem to be like this, that they have intrinsic value in combination with other qualities that have intrinsic value. That makes intuitive sense to me.
If I could jump in on that point. So it seems like maybe where we actually end up, Steve and the rest of us, isn't too different. It's just how we're getting there. Because, Steve, if you're happy to grant that in combination with moral perfection, that having more power is a good thing, then whether it's omnipotence or something that's like modified to account for not being able to do evil, it seems like you're going to be happy to grant that God having more power is a good thing. And so maybe we end up with similar conceptions of God, but the way we define God in the first place and get that result is different.
So I like your approach for common ground, but I actually don't think that's correct. I think that power is just morally irrelevant. I think it's relevant in terms of God's extrinsic value or how good the universe is, but in terms of how great God is, I don't think power is any more important than how beautiful God is. I mean,
But I thought you were granting Spencer earlier that like it would be intrinsically better, right, if he were more patient. Like assuming that his like motivations are mostly in the right place. So that a person who has like good, I think Robert Adams calls them motivational versus structural virtues, as like the right motivational virtues is motivated to do good things. But if that person has more self-control, patience, and so on, that they're intrinsically better. So are you not granting that?
Yeah, I'm not granting that. I think that's a mistake. I think what patience is, it's an enabling condition. It enables the actual intrinsic great maker. And in that sense, it functions analogous to extrinsic value rather than intrinsic value. And the way you can see it is, I just don't see that even the sort of thought experiment that Spencer has, that like patience by itself, leaving everything else fixed, is valuable. I mean, why would you care whether you're patient if there's nothing else that it contributes to? Either you or your loved ones, lives going better, you're being wiser, you're being, morally better. I mean, why would we care about the patience? Again, similarly, why would we care about how much you can bench press unless it leads to something that's valuable? And that shows that we're looking at something extrinsic, purely extrinsic.
So somebody who's like they're motivated to do the right thing, but they just chicken out, whenever they like face a tough moral choice, you'd say, no, they're not any intrinsically worse because they really their heart's in the right place. Doesn't seem plausible.
Right. I mean, what I would say is they're actually less virtuous. And then what brings it about might be like less oxygen or less patience or less power. But what matters is the fact they're less virtuous. The other are just upstream conditions. What's bringing about the fact that they're less virtuous than they otherwise could be.
So that person is less intrinsically.
Yes.
So is the difference like with God that there it's like something internal to the person, Whereas like with or if we're talking about like power just by its own, then the what causes it could be something external. I'm trying to see what the disanalogy is between like the coward who I think you've agreed is less virtuous, and God, who you think wouldn't be less intrinsically valuable if God were not as powerful as he is.
So what I think is that the sort of things like cowardice. I mean, cowardice might itself be a virtue, but let's say something like power. Let's say that causally having less power makes someone less virtuous. Well, I think we've described just what happened. I mean, their intrinsic value depends on the degree to which they're virtuous, and the power is what caused it, but it's not itself a virtue maker, and as such, it's not an intrinsic moral value maker. Similarly, if the devil's tinkering with God's thoughts makes him less virtuous, the devil's tinkering doesn't make God have less intrinsic value. Rather, it's just a cause of God's having less intrinsic value. And I think you can see that in the structure of what both you and Spencer are seeing put forth. You're saying, well, it's the combination that matters. Well, the combination matters only if there's something further we're trying to get at. And whatever we're trying to get at, I think, is what we should focus on.
I think we're at agree to disagree territory at that point. Perry, what do you got to say?
I'm curious. I don't know, Steve. What if I'm curious what you think about this, and if anything significant follows from this. But like, suppose we just grant you this point that like omnipotence isn't terribly important. It's not a great making property. But then the thought would be like, well, nevertheless, God is omnipotent because, well, this is just the most probable way for God to be, given considerations about simplicity. Does anything would that have any like what does anything significant follow from that if we just switch if we concede what you're saying and then just get omnipotence not as a great making property but just as the most probable way God would be?
Great. Yeah. So here's what follows from it. We're looking at the concept or best conception of God. Let's just talk in terms of the concept. It follows that defining God as a 3O being is just a mistake. Because number one, as I mentioned, it's not clear why it's not 4O being. People always leave it omni responsibility. But two, it's just not clear that the power should be part of the concept of God. So if you want to say, well, look, I never said it was part of the concept of God, I guess then I can agree with you on that. Again, I actually don't think he's omnipotent, but if he were, as long as we agree that God's not a 3O being,
Well,
by
on this
concept.
view, it would be that God is a 3O being, or in the sense that he's omnipotent and omniscient and perfectly good. So he would be those things on this view. It just wouldn't be because of the motivation for omnipotence. Wouldn't be because it's a great making property. It'd just be that that's the most probable way for God to be. Um, and so we could I suppose we wouldn't define God in that way, in that sense, but that would be a list that would be make it on the list of properties
That sounds reasonable to me.
everything I say sounds reasonable. So
I ask a different question of Steve, going back to something that he said towards the beginning. So I'm wondering, Steve, why, on your view, when we have these like empirical arguments for God, like fine tuning, why it bottoms out in the modal ontological argument in particular? So I think I get the line of reasoning that it's going to bottom out in that these are going to lead to a necessary being, but it seems like you could think that that God is a necessary being without accepting the modal ontological argument. For example, because you buy the kind of skepticism that Spencer and I were expressing at the beginning of, well, is this concept of like greatness like in general and not, particular to a kind, does that really make sense? And so maybe you think like, well, the modal ontological argument doesn't work because it employs this incoherent concept. But still I think that God exists of necessity, like God could not have not existed, and so is undesigned and so on. So why can't the theist just say that?
So yeah, I think that's a great point. But I have to again respectfully disagree. Number one, it leaves a brute fact. We say, well, why is God a necessary being? Well, you could say, look, it just is. It's a brute fact. There's going to be lots of brute facts. The fact that Pop-Tarts are disappearing from my plate is a brute fact. But if you think something like God's necessity should have an explanation, perhaps because you think that something has to backstop the cosmological or the fine-tuning argument, then I think what could explain why God's a necessary being? Well, other than the modal ontological argument, I'm not sure what else could explain it. That is, if God's essence doesn't explain his existence, what else would explain why he's a necessary being? In terms of the fine-tuning argument in general, and I should mention that both you and Perry have done outstanding work on this. But still, there's something like a design principle at play here. And the design principle says something like the following. if the best thing that happens, that could happen, does happen, and is extremely unlikely, then there's probably an intelligent designer. And you say, okay, well, God's the best thing that could happen. Let's say you thought God's extremely unlikely. So then God has to have a designer. And you say, well, no, he doesn't, because why doesn't God have to do a designer? Because he explains himself. Well, what else besides the modal ontological argument could account for why God explains his own existence? That is, unless you're just going to make God's necessity or his existence a brute fact, at which point we don't need the argument from fine tuning. I'm not sure how you can do without the modal ontological argument.
So, I mean, I don't think you have to say God explains himself.
Hold on.
That's not.
Maybe now would be a good time to just back up and talk about ontological arguments in general and back into this. Would that be amenable? Okay. Yeah. So this obviously has to come up in a discussion about the concept of God. This idea that if you really understand what God is, you have to see that God exists necessarily, can't not exist. So you get this argument for God's existing in the actual world by just reflecting on the concept of God, their various versions of this. I'm wondering if either of you think that there's something to this kind of argument. So I guess I might my reaction to this is to think, well, okay, if there is something that, if you define something as existing necessarily, then I guess if there's a necessary being, well, then obviously that being exists. I don't see how you get to all of God's other attributes other than necessary existence through this kind of reasoning.
Right. Well, so I think this relates to one of the things I wanted to say. So I think Steve is right that like as a historical fact, in terms of the way that people have made ontological arguments, they usually do appeal to God being the greatest possible being or something like that, and then deriving God's existence or necessary existence from that. But one thing that's unclear to me is whether you have to do that, whether that's the only way to get to the claim that God exists necessarily. So I mean, well, so let me maybe take this in two steps. So like my own reaction to the kind of classical ontological arguments like Anselm and Descartes and Plantinga and so on, usually the way I've thought about it is like, well, so take Plantinga's version where he says, let's see, so necessary existence is a great making feature, so it would be better for God to, so he says, God, it's possible that a maximally great being exists, and if it's possible, then it's necessary. So therefore, that a maximally great being exists, and then you have this idea there that necessary existence is a great making feature. The way I've tended to react to that is to think, well, if God exists, then the argument is sound, but it's not dialectically persuasive because we have no idea whether the first premise is true that such a being is possible, and so really it doesn't kind of move the needle in terms of evidence. That's tended to be my reaction to ontological arguments, because it does seem to me like I am inclined to say that God, if God exists, is metaphysically necessary. And so then if that's the case, then whether you define God in this great making way, in which case maybe Plantinga's argument is sound, or in some other way, but it seems like there's going to be an ontological argument that's sound in the sense that it's going to be true, that the conclusion that God necessarily exists is going to be true. And if you have necessarily true premises, then you're going to have a sound argument, but it might not be one that is like helpful, epistemologically helpful. Coming back then to Steve, some of the things you said. So I guess, so you said, why is God a necessary being? So you're left with this puzzle if you go the way that I was suggesting and say, well, maybe we don't find God in terms of maximal greatness, but just say he exists necessarily. And you said, if you don't say his essence explains his existence, but I didn't say his existence. I just said that the modal ontological argument is not doesn't work because maximal greatness doesn't make sense, right? I'm putting that hat on and pretending that's my view. So that there, maybe his essence explains his existence in some other way. I wouldn't usually put it in terms of like God explains himself. That sounds like kind of like an explanatory circle, but something along the lines of, well, something like this has to exist. And yeah, I don't have what the reason would be, but I guess I'm not sure that I need to know. So I don't know why 1 + 1 has to equal 2. I can see that it has to, but like I don't know if logicism is possible. It works to reduce math to logic. Lots of necessary truths that I don't know why they have to be true. So I'm not sure that I need to have epistemic access to the reason that God exists necessarily in order for it to be reasonable for me to believe that he does. If I've got independent evidence for his existence.
Just briefly on the point about the modal ontological argument, I always thought upon hearing it, that the atheist should just say, well, fine, then I guess it's not. I guess the greatest possible, a greatest, maximally great being isn't possible, or something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And
I think the interesting question is whether you can like give reasons for or against that claim that aren't just kind of these like predictions that theism and atheism make, like the problem of evil or fine tuning and so on. Like, can you look at the concept of God and say, oh well, as Steve suggested, omnipotence and omniscience, they contradict, and so then this being's impossible. So that's the kind of way that like the atheist could try to make that move.
But it does seem to me that if atheism is true, it's necessarily true.
Yeah.
It can't be. It can't.
Yes.
It's not going to be like
Yeah.
unlucky us. We were born into one of
Yeah.
the no God worlds. Like that can't be the way it is.
So I like Nevin's response, but Nevin seemed to say, look, God necessarily exists. So I asked Nevin, okay, well, what's the explanation for that? And by explanation, I mean either what's the cause for that or what's the reason for that. And Nevin says, well, look, I don't have one. Well, then, if you're going to use the principle of sufficient reason, for example, elsewhere, let's say in the cosmological argument, that's going to be a problem. But in addition, if you can say that God has necessary existence, why can't you use one of Peter Milliken's example? Why can't we say like a bunnyquin, which is a type of bunny that necessarily exists? Why can't there be those? Why aren't those possible? Now, I thought that Nevin introduced Alvin Plantinga's approach, which I think is the right approach for the theist to make, which is the reason that God necessarily exists is that independence is a great maker. And because God is the greatest possible being, he has every great maker to a maximal degree. Now, here we have an explanation as to why God necessarily exists, but it depends on God being the greatest possible being. That's fine, but then what would establish why the greatest possible being actually exists? It's going to have to be something like the modal ontological argument. What else would explain that? But just one last thing, and that is it's not clear that necessary properties are always better than contingent properties. So consider, for example, whether it's better to be necessarily all good. You might think the answer to that is no, because if you're necessarily all good, you can't perform evil acts. And if you can't perform evil acts, then you're not responsible for avoiding evil acts. That is, you're not significantly responsible. That's the case where being contingently good might be better than being necessarily good. So why would we think that necessary existence is better than contingent existence? That is, just one more example, imagine someone's wife, Alice, is the perfect wife for him. In fact, she's the perfect woman for him. But in other possible worlds, she's absolutely a horrendous person. Should we say that somehow she's less good, simplicator, less good for the husband just because she's contingently perfect rather than necessarily perfect? I don't see why. So 3 quick points. Number one, I think that if God necessarily exists, we have to explain it. Only the ontological argument can explain it. 2, it's not clear that contingent goodness or contingent existence is worse than necessary existence. And 3, when we go to Plantinga, Plantinga seems to say, look, what locks in God's necessary existence is something like the modal ontological argument.
I just want to come back on one of those if I can. Hold on. I'm tempted to say more, but I just want to focus in on the second point. I think it was. So why not other necessary things? Why can't like bunny rabbit be necessary and so on? And what I want to say is that look, I don't need to know what the reason is that God is that God exists necessarily if he does exist necessarily in order to be able to reasonably say that it's more plausible that God would exist necessarily than that a bunny rabbit would exist necessarily. Because, like, for example, we can look at some features that the bunny rabbit has. Like, it's a material thing. You could sort of make it graphic. You can cut it up, right? You could, like, clearly it doesn't exist necessarily, right? Like, material things can be broken apart. Matter can be transformed into energy. It's like like just an ordinary material object clearly cannot exist necessarily. Now, like a mind, that's something that, like, I'm not sure that whether there are any necessary minds, but like it doesn't seem impossible. It's not like obviously epistemically impossible in the same way that, like an ordinary physical thing. Now, maybe like the universe as a whole could be necessary. That's not something I would roll out a priori, but I think that you can make like reasonable different judgments about the plausibility of different kinds of things existing necessarily, even if you don't have like an answer to all these questions about what's the whole metaphysical story of what's going on here.
I wanted to respond to another point of Steve with the Alice example, where Alice is a great wife in this possible world, but in all these nearby possible worlds, she's like horrendous. And I'm supposed to have the intuition that those other possible worlds don't bear on her goodness in this possible world. I don't have this intuition because I think of myself as like, look, I want to be a great father in, obviously most of all in the actual world. But if I'm a terrible father in a lot of nearby possible worlds, that seems to suggest that my being a good father in this world depends heavily on moral luck. And it would be better if I had a more stably good character traits, such that so that it wouldn't matter whether these contingencies arose. I'd still be a good father. I think that's a better state of affairs in the actual world. Now, I think we've talked about virtue before, and I think you just have a different intuition about this and don't think virtue is intrinsically valuable. But I think it matters not just that I do the right thing, but that I wouldn't have done the wrong thing had things been slightly different.
I think you mischaracterized my account. One, I didn't say nearby possible worlds. I just said some possible worlds. There might be distant possible worlds. But imagine you have two characters, A and B, and they are intrinsic doppelgangers in the actual world, right? I mean, Alice and Betty are identically good as people, as wives, as mothers, etc. But at distant possible worlds, Betty is horrendous and Alice is good across all possible worlds. But that does not bear on any intrinsic feature in the actual world. Why should we care about merely modal properties? Now, your view might be something like, that the modal ontological puts forth, which is that, look, just independence itself is a great maker. I guess I'm not seeing it. I don't know why we would care whether Alice is better than Betty in distant possible worlds, given that they're intrinsically identical in the actual world. But even if we should care about it, the notion that independence is a great maker is really going to get the theist into trouble when it comes to world creation. Because then we have to say, okay, look, God's features have to be entirely independent. But if he's going to use brute, or that is arbitrary preferences to decide which world to create or whether to create it at all, then that's going to be another problem for independence. So in other words, there's a dilemma that applies to the theist. Either the theist says, look, modal perfection is not better than contingent perfection, which I think is fairly plausible. But if the theist doesn't say that, then independence is really going to come in when it comes to world creation. That is, which world does God create? Because God's creation is going to have to be independent. That is, his psychology and his acts have to be independent, but not if they depend on random or arbitrary factors or brute facts.
I guess I'm just rebelling against the intuition you're trying to elicit. Even if you make it the one wife only behaves badly in the very distant possible worlds, that still seems like it's somewhat worse. It's somewhat worse, and it does seem to me that it bears on our valuation of her in the actual world, albeit to just a small degree. But you can see it more if you just make it lots of nearby possible worlds. Then it really seems like her goodness in this one is just kind of happenstance and less attributable to virtue. And you get that to a smaller degree as the worlds get more distant, it seems to me.
I basically agree with Spencer. I'll just add one thing. I think if Steve, if you say that, like, well, it's, if it's like a really distant possible world, then it doesn't matter. You're going to face kind of a threshold problem, right? Where you say, well, no, I didn't say like nearby possible worlds, but okay, well, this like kind of medium distance possible world, well, still a little bit bad, but where do you draw the line, right? Like, this I don't even know how you measure distance, but, like, you got this like possible world, it's like medium far out, then this one that's just a little farther out, suddenly there's this like sharp cutoff where it doesn't matter after that. That seems weird.
So I'm at a kind of loss as to your intuition. So Alice and Betty, by hypothesis, are intrinsically identical. Let's say they're even extrinsically identical in the actual world. So there's nothing, but in some distant possible world, in the bottom 10% of distant worlds, let's say, Betty is really evil and Alice continues her like trans world greatness. And you say, well, that makes Alice better than Betty.
I'm not sure I can make I'm not sure I can make sense of this thought experiment. They're intrinsically identical, and yet they behave differently in different possible worlds.
Because they have different purely modal properties. I mean, if you want to build in the fact that one is psychologically better than the other in the actual world, well, I'm going to agree with you. We're not going to get a good test case. But remember, if you're putting forth these views of God, what you're saying is what matters is trans world perfection, not actual world perfection. And I just, for the life of me, I can't see why we would care about that. Why would you care about whether your wife is, sterling across all the possible worlds, or sterling across 90% of the possible worlds, but at the distant most 10, she really shows signs of extreme evil? I mean,
but in God's case, it's got to be, if there's a difference, it's got to be due to intrinsic qualities, right? Because God isn't like, it's not like God can be in the situation where, well, in one world, he might have like faced this external temptation, that Betty like faces in a nearby world, whereas Alice, she doesn't, like, in no nearby worlds does she face temptation. So no, like any difference in God, it's because God is the first mover and so on. If he behaves differently in different worlds, it would have to be because of something intrinsic, right?
I mean, that's the way I look at it. But if that's the case, then it's not clear why it's not the intrinsic, actual property that matters rather than modal properties.
Well, I guess what I'm suggesting is that the two are going to co-vary essentially. And so then the modal properties will be a guide to the intrinsic properties. And so even if you think the modal properties like aren't the things, the valuable things themselves, then if there's a modal difference, then there is an intrinsic difference.
Yeah, I think we agree on that. Yeah.
Perry, what do you think of all this?
Was first looking for some I wanted some clarification here. Steve, were you saying that like whether you have a property necessarily just never matters, or just that there's some cases in which it doesn't matter?
I'm saying never matters in terms of greatness, in terms of an individual's greatness. It doesn't matter. It's as Nevin, a position that Nevin put forth. It might be evidence, or it might be something that contributes or enables actual world greatness, but it doesn't itself matter.
Yeah, I think roughly what Nevin said is right, but I also think that like here's a case where I think having something necessarily can matter. Like I think necessary existence would be like better than contingent existence, insofar as it means that you have this kind of invulnerability about it, and a being that's invulnerable is going to be better. I think that is vulnerable, and so there's a case where I think necessity can play a role. I mean, if it can play a role there, it might be able to play a role in these other areas as well. But at least it's I think that there are some cases in which the necessity will matter.
So if I could just respond, I mean, so even if that were true, I mean, I think what we're getting at all this is that there's a common view that independence is a great maker. And by independence, we don't mean just God's existence, but also his psychology and how he acts on it. So in some sense, God's independence is a great maker. So if we assume that, right, then if I can show that God is not independent, is necessarily not independent, then that's going to be a real problem for the very concept of God, or the best conception of it. And I think we can see it in terms of, imagine there are worlds that are tied for the best possible world, right? Because there's certain facts, the width of it, particularly an unimportant mud molecule that's sort of morally unimportant. So their different worlds have different, this mud molecule differs in width. Or you might think there's an infinite sequence of ever better worlds, and that God has to use a brute preference, or create a flourish, or a random number generator by which to pick which worlds create. Well, then it follows that he's not independent, because some feature about his thought process is random, or it's affected by an extrinsic agent, and it's affected by an extrinsic event. So if God has to decide whether to create a world extrinsic to him or not, and if he does create a world, which worlds create, if that's going to involve some sort of arbitrary or random factor, doesn't that show that God necessarily is not entirely independent?
What was the upshot if God's not independent again? I think I missed that part.
Well, so if you think independence is a great maker, if you say, look, despite your claim with Alice and Betty and, that ridiculous thought experiment that we can't make sense of, if you think, look, what's really going on here is just independence is a great maker, right? So that's what you're missing, Kershnar. Independence is a great maker. Let me concede that. And then say, okay.
Steve, could you define independence for us? I'm not sure we've defined it. And it might be helpful for the audience too.
I mean, there's something which doesn't explain. So being is independent if and only if nothing extrinsic to him nor randomness explains why he exists, or some feature of him.
By feature here, are you including only intrinsic features or extrinsic features as well?
Only intrinsic features.
So you don't think there's any special problem if God's thoughts or behavior change in response to human free choices, right?
Yeah, that's one thing I was going to ask.
Right. So that's going to be a problem, right? So I don't think God actually answers prayers. It's going to be a separate argument. But you're right. There's going to be a problem if God responds to people's free choices. Fair enough. But All I have to show is that that God is not 100% independent. And if we ask, does God make arbitrary choices in deciding whether to create a world extrinsic to him or not? Remember, he's already maximally intrinsically good, so he doesn't make the world better by creating a world extrinsic to him. And if he does create a world extrinsic to him, if there are ties for the best possible worlds or an infinite sequence of ever better worlds, and he has to randomly choose which one to create, then it seems he's not independent because his thought process is not explained by and only by features of him. And if that's the case, it's hard to see how he can be independent given that he has to choose whether to create a world and which world to create.
I just feel like this kind of objection can be responded by recourse to the same move I borrowed from Perry earlier with regard to God's omnipotence, which is to say, fine, the greatest amount of that compatible with his other essential features or something like that. So if God's got to be a little bit dependent because due to his benevolence, he creates beings with free wills who make choices, which he then responds to, and that sacrifices a tiny amount of this great making feature, but he gets a lot of, but it scores him, in that scenario, he scores much more highly in other great making features. I don't see why this is some like deep conundrum that the theist should fret about.
Can I add on to that? So with this, in the same spirit, I think what Steve is doing here is just kind of helping refine the concept of God. So doing perfect being theology. He's not really offering an argument against theism. So I think this makes Steve a theologian technically.
Steve the theologian. That's terrifying. That is terrible.
The notion is, response is, look, God is only 70% independent. He's 30% dependent. If you can say that about his intrinsic features, why not say that about his existence? Why not say, look, he's 70% independent for existence, but 30% he's not. Once you go down this path, two things become apparent. Number one, it's not clear how you stop this. He's only 70% independent from spreading. But number two, it seems that you lose the modal ontological argument. The modal ontological argument what it rides on is his being 100% independent for his existence. Now, if you want to say, look, I'm giving up the modal ontological argument in order to trade off independent for other things, that's fine. But I think the price you pay for doing that is you give up the modal ontological argument, because the modal ontological argument depends on independence, 100% independence being a great maker. Now, I know, Nevin and Perry are going to disagree with me on this, but if you think that the theist lives or dies on the soundness of the modal ontological argument, they're in effect giving up theism by making that concession.
I like Spencer's idea that maybe we just need as much as is compatible with the other properties, but I was thinking of something slightly different. That, well, is there some principled way that we could limit independence here to say God's fundamental attributes or something like that? Those need to, God's existence and God's fundamental attributes, let's say, those need to be independent. But God is going to have these kind of downstream attributes, making a particular choice, reacting in a particular way to, some creatures' free choice and so on. And that those things are dependent seems less problematic. So what about that?
So the problem with that is, leaving aside the responding to free creatures, which again, I just claim that God doesn't do. But look, if they're different greatest possible beings, each who have different group preferences. So greatest possible being 1 wants to create world number 37. Greatest possible being 2 wants to create world 96. If we're going to reason from the fact that a being is the greatest possible being to his existence, then we have a problem if there are multiple or competitor greatest possible beings. And we get that if different greatest possible beings can have different group preferences.
Well, you're describing these as different beings, but they could be the same being who, so I got the picture I'm thinking is God's God's choosing. So let's take the model where there are equally good worlds for simplicity. Say there's 10 equally good worlds. And what I'm thinking is that God, in his fundamental attributes, God doesn't prefer any of those worlds. But then, God either just makes a choice or, maybe forms a group preference, if you like, and could have formed a different one. So yes, there are 10 different ways that God could have gone. But I think it's a little bit misleading to say there are 10 different gods. Possible gods. There's just this one possible god. And as far as God's fundamental attributes go, those are essential. those couldn't have been different. It's just in terms of these kind of downstream things, like making this particular choice. That's what could have been different.
Am I missing?
So just to quick, I'm not sure why they're not fundamental. I mean, why isn't it fundamental whether to create a world extrinsic to you or which world to create? And second, why doesn't that violate the principle of sufficient reason? That nothing explains why God has this preference rather than another.
Well, that's going to be, I mean, your form of the principle of sufficient reason. If you're a libertarian about free will, then you're going to think that you can't have a wholly general form of that, that there's going to be some unexplained things. And so that's going to apply to God here, presumably. So I don't think there's a particular problem for God here. What was the first question again, Steve? I'm not sure if it's just me, but you.
First question, why isn't the decision whether to create a world extrinsic to him or which world to create once he decides to do so? Why isn't that a fundamental preference or feature of him?
I'm not sure why it has to be. Like God's fundamental attributes, we give like God's fundamental attributes, omnipotence, omniscience, moral perfection, and so on, immateriality. And then, God exists necessarily. And then, okay, now God faces this choice: create a world or don't create a world. Why does that have to be? That's not like part of the essential fundamental things that God chooses one way or another. So it's a choice that God faces. It's like, why does it have to be fundamental to me that like that I get married at age 21 or something like that? I could have done something different. The two don't seem disanalogous.
Well, I'm not sure why it's not part of omnibenevolence. That is, why isn't it part of omnibenevolence whether you think that you want to create or not create extrinsic to you?
Well, I was assuming that we have like two equally good options. So like, suppose that it would be equally good to create a world and not create a world.
Well, so Nevin, isn't there an issue here with now you're introducing brute facts in divine psychology? Isn't there something like unattractive about that theoretically? Like, wouldn't it be better to have all of God's personality features fall out of his essential attributes or be derivative from his essential attributes?
Yeah, there are going to be brute facts here in whatever sense there are brute facts for any libertarian theory of free will, I would think. And so if you think that that's bad elsewhere, maybe you'll think it's bad here. I'm not sure there's something especially bad for God. I mean, I can kind of see, maybe I can see what you're saying. Like, well, there'd be something like something nice about, everything about God is essential and so on. But if you follow that where it leads, then modal collapse and so on. Well, that looks pretty bad. So then you might, in the end, say that that this is a better way to go.
Well, I was just thinking the simple thought that God is supposed to be the ultimate explanation. Mm-hmm. And so this is not a place where I would want to find brute facts, I guess.
But I mean, suppose that there are two equally good choices that God faces. Then it seems like it would be better for there to be brute facts than for God to like essentially prefer one to the other, right?
Does he have to? Can't he just do all of them in different possible worlds? Like, why?
Well, like complete possible world. Wait. So sorry. He could do different ones in different possible worlds. But what he does in the actual world will be contingent, right?
I mean, he did the other good thing in another possible world. So what are we losing out on?
Well, but that's not the actual world. So, like if I exist in the in possible world 1 and not in possible world 2, I sure care whether possible world 1 is the actual one, right? I'm sure glad that, that God made this world, not this other world that's like equally good, but it has this other person whose existence is incompatible with mine, right?
I suppose I'm struggling to see what the challenge is, though. Like, yes, I would hope that, but I struggle to see how this would bear on God's existence.
Here would be one way to see it. I mean, Nevin said, why assume that there's multiple gods rather than one God? But imagine in one possible world, and we're talking here like abstract universals, and one abstract universal has a God with a preference for world number 37. And in that same possible world, we have an abstract universal with the same like 3.0 features, but he has a preference for world 96. Why think that has to be one being rather than two? That is, why think that you're not creating the possibility of multiple greatest possible beings rather than just saying, look, here's a contingent feature of the greatest possible being? But in addition, I'm going to just want to reiterate Spencer's objection. Look, if we're looking for the ultimate explanation and we start, letting in these sort of brute preferences, right, unexplained preferences, I mean, where's the stopping point? I'm just not sure once we let in these brute preferences that there's any stopping point. And then third, your response to the principle of sufficient reason is, well, libertarian free will, arguably, violates the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, I mean, that's an excellent reason to reject the libertarian free will. I mean, doesn't allow in contrastive reasons, for example. So I'm just not sure, again, why we don't think there are multiple beings here rather than one, and also why we want brute facts in our ultimate explanation.
Just on why there's one rather than multiple beings. I think my intuitions here are something like it's not so it's something like the essentiality of origins idea. So it's not going to be exactly that because God exists necessarily, but um, take the idea that when like thinking of humans as like embodied physical creatures. So like a sperm and an egg combine. I kind of have the Kripkean intuition. Okay, that I can get in the headspace where I have this. That okay, like that couldn't have been a different person, right? And that person couldn't have been like the combination of some other sperm and egg. And then once that person's there, right now, then and I mean let's suppose we're whatever past the point of possibility of twinning or whatever, and conceptions or like there's a determinate person, right? Okay, so once that person's there, well, okay, two possible worlds in which that person, world one, that person grows up to be a philosopher. World two, that person grows up to be an opera singer. Well, it's the same person in both worlds, right? He just makes different choices. But it's like the origins. That's what's essential. And in God's case, God doesn't have like an origin in time or something, but God exists necessarily, and so it's going to be his essential, like fundamental features. Those are going to be the ones that are that make God the thing that he is. And then you take this other world in which God makes a different choice. Well, that's not a different God. It's just the same God that makes a different choice in the same way that like the human being that goes on to become a philosopher in World One and an opera singer in World Two, but results from the same sperm and egg is the same human being in both cases.
Can I make sure I'm tracking this? The problem. So supposing that God is arbitrarily choosing between two, or at least two sufficiently good options. The problem, Steve, is that gives up on independence. But if we just go back to our earlier point that then so much for independence, is there a different problem that follows, or is it still just on the independence issue there for you?
If you dump independence as a great maker, you lose the modal ontological argument. That is, God's essence no longer explains his existence.
Right. Okay.
Now, we might differ as to the degree that's a price, but that is a price you pay nonetheless. The cost of giving up an independence is to give up on the modal ontological
Well,
argument.
hold on. Essence explains existence is different from modal ontological argument. Modal ontological argument is like all this stuff about maximally great being, right? So that I'm not sure that you lose essence explains existence necessarily. You lose like God is the greatest possible being, and that's why his essence explains his existence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was assuming that his essence is being the greatest possible being. So I'm not sure just yeah, I think we're agreeing here.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, just a sociological fact. I assume like if you're losing the modal ontological argument in one sense, not many theists are going to mind since so few are going to defend it. But or do you mean they have to think it's not sound? That was what you were saying, wasn't it? That they'd have to say the modal ontological. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that'd be a price. But if you can get the way Nevin was saying, I suppose that wouldn't be too high a price. But yeah, I don't know. I got to think about that a little more.
Okay, I think you lost me. How is it that you have to give up the modal ontological argument if you give up on God's ultimate independence? Because it's compromising a great making feature.
It's the great making feature that makes the modal ontological argument go, right. What it says is it's greater for a being to exist necessarily than contingently. And you think, okay, why is it better for a being to exist necessarily than contingently? Because independence is a great making feature. So if you give up on independence, you can't explain why it's better to exist necessarily than contingently. And if you can't explain why it's better to exist necessarily than contingently, then you lose the modal ontological argument.
Well, I don't know if that's right.
You lose it even if he's as independent as it's possible for a being to be. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you do, because you still have to explain why he necessarily exists rather than contingently exists. If he only has 70% independence, then why think that necessary existence follows from 70% independence?
Well, I mean, why think that you might be able to recognize a great making property without being able to explain why it is a great making property? In which case, you could say you could think that that necessary existence is one, and maybe without that being a problem. Alternatively, I think like I was saying earlier, you might just think it's like just it being necessarily existent makes you invulnerable. And I don't know if being invulnerable is the same. I don't think it's the same thing as being independent, but that might be a different motivation for it. So I don't think the inability to explain is a problem here necessarily. There might be different explanations available.
All right, let's take stock. We've been doing this for a while. What have we not talked about that we need to talk about? Steve, what do you think?
I think what we need to talk about is whether or not God is responsible. I think even if you're a theist, you think God is not responsible. Why? Well, because he's not responsible for psychology. He's not responsible for how his psychology generates his actions. And if he's not responsible, if he's not responsible for P, and if he's not responsible for P entails Q, then he's not responsible for Q. Here I'm stealing Peter Van Inwagen's ideas. Now you might say, so what? So famously, I'm not sure if Perry holds this view, but famously in our discussions with Perry, from which we learn a lot, as I should note, Nathan Bray and I, Perry said, so God's not responsible. So what? And you might think, well, here's what so what is. If you think that we should worship God, presumably what you mean is we should be grateful to him. But you can be grateful to someone only if they're praiseworthy for benefiting you. And praiseworthy for benefiting you only if they're responsible. So that's one thing you give up. The second thing you give up are a whole bunch of features that religious folk often assume, right? They assume things like, the free will defense is important. Free will is important for people. That people have, there's a soul-making theodicy. It's good that people form their own souls. And that who goes to heaven or hell depends on choices for which they're responsible. But why the asymmetry? Why is responsibility so important for human beings, but so unimportant for God?
One reason would be that if we grant your argument that shows that God's not responsible, the reason it's not important for God is because it's impossible for God to have, but then it wouldn't be impossible for humans. And if you do think it's impossible for humans, then I guess those things wouldn't follow as well. But I think that even if we say that you're right, that there's no responsibility, I still think you can get like reason to be grateful, because again, let's think about a case where God can create from a multitude of different worlds, and he creates the one that you happen to exist in. Well, that's reason to be grateful. Or you might think that there's different, like in our world, there are different prayers that God could answer. He doesn't, he's got to make some arbitrary choices about which ones to answer because they're not all compatible with each other. In that case, you can be grateful that your prayer was answered or something like that. So I still think that even granting, if we get rid of responsibility, there's still real cases where there's a real sense in which you ought to be grateful.
If I could just jump in before Steve responds, I think what you might be suggesting, Perry, is that say there are like 100 equally good worlds and God chooses between them. Suppose all of these involve like creating a universe. So universe in the sense of like a spatio-temporal region. The world is like everything, including God. So like all of these involve creating a universe. But then like which universe God creates, or with its specifics later on and so on, is up to him. Well, so then God would be responsible for creating this universe, I think, if I understood Steve's argument, but not responsible for creating some universe or other. So he has to create something. We're like granting Steve that, and he's not responsible for creating something, but that he created the specific one in which you exist, Perry, and your prayers are answered. That's something that he is responsible for. It seems like that. Yeah. That's what you should say here.
Steve's going to say, no, he's still not responsible for creating this universe, and I want to say, I can still grant that, and it still seems like you ought to be grateful that your universe was chosen, or in cases where we have multiple incompatible prayers or something, that your prayer was answered over the other one or something like that. So I'm trying to grant Steve everything he's saying and then say, well, it still seems like there are clear cases where there be praiseworthiness or where it would be appropriate to be grateful or something like that. Like if I had an indeterminate coin or something and I flip it about whether I'm going to give Spencer or Nevin $1 million, and it lands on Nevin, seems like he can be grateful to me or something in some sense.
Okay, well now I want to hear from Steve. Is God responsible if he's making an arbitrary choice or not?
No, there's nothing. It's more specifically he's not praiseworthy. And here's an analogy. Imagine that Nevin is forced by some manipulator to give a box of Rice Krispies. By the way, I'm stealing this example from Klaus Craig. Nevin's forced by a manipulator to give a box of Rice Krispies to Perry Hendricks. But there's one of a million different boxes, all of which are identical, that he can give. And then Nevin picks out box, 467. And And you say, well, sure, Nevin's praiseworthy for giving Perry a box of Rice Krispies, but why? He's not praiseworthy for giving a box, whatever it turns to be. It's completely arbitrary which box he turns out.
Okay, I just want to figure out what's important in the thought experiment. So that they're identical? Does it matter? Like, what if I could choose the cereal? Then do you still say I'm not responsible? Like I have to give him some cereal, but I can choose which one. Does the example still work?
Yeah, as long as it's arbitrary.
Okay.
I mean, so let's just assume this ties among best possible worlds.
But here's a case of disanalogy here is when we're choosing which world to create. So in the case that you gave, Nevin's going to get cereal no matter what. But in the case of world creation, you're not going to be created no matter what. It depends that you actually end up existing in that world. So there's a key difference there, I think.
Yeah, Perry really likes Rice Krispies, and that's the one I happen to pick. So he can be grateful to me. Like, I didn't have a choice but to give him some cereal, but I picked the one he likes best. So he's grateful, right?
But I'm gonna just posit that the worlds are sort of equally good. I mean, if we want to have an infinite sequence of ever better worlds, then there's an issue.
Yeah.
It's going to be arbitrary.
They're equally good overall, we're imagining, but they might be better for Perry, right? So Perry can be grateful because, like, hey, this is the one that's best for him.
Right, but notice if you think that God is fully compelled, he wouldn't be responsible for the choice because we're not responsible when we are fully compelled. And if we're not responsible, we're not praiseworthy. Now, what Perry's early response is, which I thought was a really strong one, is to say, look, there's types of gratitude which is not tied to praiseworthiness. So if I'm swimming along and a bull shark's about to bite me, but an even larger white shark then eats the bull shark, and you think, well, I can be grateful to the white shark because the white shark benefited me. Well, not kind of core gratitude, not paradigmatic gratitude. The white shark couldn't care less about you. White shark might not even have noticed you. So why, if God's not responsible, why would he be praiseworthy?
You say God is fully compelled, but in the thought experiment, God is not fully compelled. God has the choice to create world 1 through 100, let's say, and he chooses to create the world 47 where Perry exists. So he's not compelled to do them. And, sure. So the others are equally good, but this is the one where Perry exists. So it makes sense for him to be grateful. And God didn't have to do that.
So you're right. Yeah, so I'm giving two different arguments. One is from compulsion, and the other is from arbitrary choice.
Okay.
So my point is that if you thought God were compelled, then you would think he's not responsible. If he's not responsible, he's not praiseworthy. A separate argument is you think, well, if God has a brute preference and the brute preference benefits me, then he's praiseworthy for making that brute preference. But my claim he's not praiseworthy. Sorry, he's praiseworthy for making an arbitrary choice, but my claim he's not. When you're compelled to make a choice and then you make an arbitrary one among the possibility of choices that you're mandated to make, you're not praiseworthy for doing that.
Hey, Steve, are you saying that compulsion undermines responsibility, even in the case where the thing compelling you is your own essential nature?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay, I don't think so.
Yeah, I also don't share that intuition.
Well, let me give an example. What would distinguish? Take. Let's say we 100% manipulate Patty Hearst, and then immediately after manipulation, she chooses something. She robs the Hibernia Bank. Well, they would say she's not responsible, right? Because she didn't choose her psychology, and she didn't choose whether to act on that psychology in the way that it flowed, even if it flowed indeterministically from her psychology. We agree on the manipulation case.
I'm not sure.
Second case, Patty Hearst is instantly created. Right? So instead of being manipulated, she's instantly created. Immediately upon instant creation, she robs the bank. Again, she's not. What's the difference between the manipulation case and the instant creation case? Third case, Patty Hearst has her psychology essentially, and immediately after having this essential psychology, imagine, she robs the bank. What's the difference between instant creation and having your psychology essentially? That is, if you're not responsible for manipulation, you're not going to be responsible for instant creation. If you're not responsible for instant creation, you're not responsible if you have your psychology essentially. Why? Because if you have your psychology essentially, you don't have control over it in any meaningful way. And if you don't have control of your psychology, you're not going to have control over which actions it generates. So that's why you should think that if God has a psychology essentially, that he's not responsible.
To be clear, this flows from your view that no one is responsible, correct?
No, it does not.
Or it implies that
here it's perfectly compatible to say, look, plenty of people are responsible. God's not among them. Why? Because his thoughts and his actions are fully compelled. Your thoughts and actions are not fully compelled, which is why, you're kind of a funny, very pleasant guy. But sadly, you're responsible and God's not.
Yeah, I guess so. Again, in that case, like, well, I'll just repeat my what I said earlier is like, then it's like you've shown us that God can't lift a rock that's too heavy. It's like, well, I suppose we've just learned something about God then. But maybe Spencer and Nevin have different takes.
Well, yeah. So if it turns out that responsibility is in principle impossible for anyone to have, then I suppose God's lacking it isn't such a devastating point, and we would rethink our ideas about reactive attitudes to fit in with this metaphysical reality you've just shown us, if your argument is right. So I just think we would reconsider the notion of gratitude to be more like gratitude is more like I'm now forgetting what the distinction in the gratitude literature, where gratitude that something is the case versus the agent directed form of it that is more responsive to responsibility. We would just shift our notion of gratitude over. That would be a minor revision, but I don't see anything devastating here.
Here, I want to jump in and switch sides momentarily and defend Steve for a minute. So I think two things that I think I could say on in defense of the line Steve is pushing with our conversation. So one, I think the objection that Perry and I have been raising, that, well, if God could still choose between the 100 options or whatever, and then we could be grateful for that. You might still think it's bad if, like, you can't be grateful to God for, say, creating in the first place, or for kind of these very general things that he was compelled to do. And those seem to be things that are important for worship and so on. Like, we're supposed to be grateful to God for creating the universe, and not just like for creating me, or for this particular blessing that I've gotten. So it does seem like that would be a bad consequence if we weren't able to, if all we could say was that kind of line about choosing among the equally good options. And then the second thing is, so I think so in response to what you're saying, Spencer, and Perry, your line that, well, he's just doing perfect being theology. I think if we have our concept of God as like perfect being, then yeah, maybe what's going on is Steve is just showing us that, well, this is like, God can't create a rock so heavy he can't lift it. So we need to understand omnipotence compatible with that. And so responsibility is just impossible, or impossible for God at least. But and so then to finish that out. So then the greatest possible being would be one that isn't responsible, but if your notion of God is like this worship worthiness notion, which I think there is like a decent case to be made as important, at least for like religious conceptions of God, then you might think this shows that kind of God is impossible. And that would be a bad result.
On the first point, I don't think it would be that God's compelled to choose to create between worlds 1 through 100. Let's say it would be more like God might create, and if he does create, then it would be one of those such worlds. So I think that worry can be easily addressed. And then on the second one, yeah, I agree that losing. Yeah, so maybe that's a good way for Steve to. Yeah, maybe that's a good reply. Is that there are some things that it would be a real cost. Worship worthiness would be one. Although I think I think there might. It's not obvious to me that getting rid of responsibility would eliminate worship worthiness. Yeah, so it's not obvious to me that it would. I've got to think about that a bit more, though.
So here, I think, is the cost that the theist pays for saying, well, okay, Perry's response, I think, is a brilliant one. We should say, okay, God's not responsible. We've learned something about God. We haven't seen an argument against his existence. Well, one, as Nevin pointed out, there might be a problem with worship. Number two, there's a problem with picking out which is the O that defines God. I mean, why not say that God is omni-responsible and say, like, that's the O that matters? We should drop the other three O's, right? Why give essentially omnibenevolence priority over essential omni-responsibility? So I think that's the second problem in deciding, okay, how do we prioritize the O's? But third, I think our concept of God, it just shows our intuitions are highly unstable. And here's an example. Would you rather that God be necessarily all good and not responsible because of compulsion, or contingently all good and maximally responsible? Now, my intuition is I prefer the second God, right? I don't like the Stepford God. I like the free will God. But that shows our intuitions about the features of God are unstable. Now, is that enough to show they're incoherent? And I guess the degree to which you think sort of unstable intuitions undermine our evidence for God's existence. But I do think there's a serious price to be paid if you go down Perry's route and say, okay, God's not responsible, so what?
I have one other point or question I want to raise. It's kind of a meta level point. So let me start by asking Steve a question, and we've had a bit of an exchange about this, Steve, at the Purdue conference. But let's see how to put it. So what would be your degree of confidence, Steve, that there is some coherent conception of God, let's say, like of a God that is worthy of worship?
It would be low, but not zero.
Okay. Is it about, like, is it on the order of 1%, 0.1%, one in a million?
I don't want it in a million. It would be low. 1% sounds right. As a side note, after we spoke to Nevin's points were so good. I went down, I wrote them down. I'm like, that's a series of excellent points. I take notes when I talk to these guys.
So here's why I asked the question. So we said at the beginning that we should be looking at the a priori and the a posteriori considerations when we're reasoning about theism, and I think that there's a way that it can be tempting to approach these kinds of debates about the coherence of theism, in which you think like, well, look, I've got this good argument that theism is incoherent, so there, I don't need to take seriously like the fine-tuning argument and so on. But I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I think that these arguments about these a priori arguments, like, they are important, but what they do is that they impact the prior probability of theism. So they let us see, okay, before we look at the evidence, how confident should we be in this theory? And, if we say, oh, look, we've got these good arguments that make it look like maybe this theory is incoherent, then, and we think it's, there's only a 1% chance these arguments fail, well, then that should lead us to like downgrade the prior probability of theory by, like initially we thought it was 10%, now we should think it's, 10% divided by 100. So it's like 0.1%, so we downgrade them like in accordance with the arguments. But then we still got to look at the, the fine tuning argument and all these other things. And then, the fine tuning evidence is very powerful. So like you can get empirical evidence for a theory that could outweigh like the a priori reasons that you might have had initially to doubt.
Well, wait. Don't you need to have a coherent conception of God in order to have a theory about which to assign any kind of probability, like in the first place?
I mean, I guess that you need to have some idea of what a theory says in order to be able to derive predictions from it. But I take it that, like in science, often our theories are extremely complicated. And it's often an open question, like, is quantum mechanics consistent with special relativity, say? Like, is there a way to reconcile those? Or does, does something have to be false? And I take it that kind of thing. I mean, I think maybe in that case, we're like pretty confident that they are inconsistent. But, I take it that it can be an open question with these like really complicated theories, whether the whole thing is ultimately consistent. But like we can still derive predictions from them because we have a good enough idea of what particular parts of them say and so on, and we can still confirm and disconfirm them. So it seems to me like it is possible to do some empirical reasoning about God, even if there are some open questions about the definitional issues.
All right, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure. I think we've gone on for a good while now, and I'm going to have to edit all this, so I think it's time to wrap it up. Anyone have any final words? That sounded sinister. I meant that in a non-sinister way. Would anyone have anything else you wish to say? Parting words.
No, it was a great comment.
It was an okay conversation. I guess I wanted to make one last point is that, so I guess it's worth noting that so we talked about two different ways to think about God earlier. One was the a priori way, which Steve is doing. The other is the a posteriori way. And I guess, I don't know, it's interesting, like if Steve's arguments are right, which as usual they're not, then, that doesn't tell us that there is no omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good being. What it does is eliminate one particular way of getting to that being. Yeah, that's what I got.
So I just again, I really enjoy talking to you guys. But look, my claim was that the fine-tuning argument, which you guys both put forth very powerful versions of, depends on the modal ontological argument. I mean, that's a claim. And you guys want to say, no, there's separate types of evidence, and I can assess them independently. And I just want to deny that. I just want to say, look, the design principle, which makes the intelligent design argument work, the fine-tuning argument work, presupposes that God himself doesn't have an intelligent designer. Well, why not? Well, I don't see how you can help yourself to that without the a priori arguments.
So you got this hypothesis that that things work out in that way, and you think, well, I've antecedently pretty confident it's not true, but if it were true, look, it would explain all this stuff, like the fine tuning, and so it's a very powerful explanation. So you end up getting a posteriori evidence for it.
All right, guys, I think we do need to call it a night. Thanks again, each of you, for making the time. It's been really interesting, and I look forward to seeing the finished result.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
That was great. You guys are great. And Perry drove an ambulance for how many hours before you showed up? I'm impressed. I would definitely be out of energy.
Today was 12 hours, but I did a 48-hour shift last week.
Really?
I got to sleep for some of it though each night, but got woken up pretty early. Well, not too early. It was like one was like 4 a.m. and one was like 5:30 a.m. or something. But
that's impressive.
Yeah.
I know. I know that.
We should all be grateful to you.
Assuming
you should be so grateful that you hire me for something, and then I can stop driving the ambulance.
Well, I would push for that to hire you at Fredonia, but unfortunately, there's no philosophy left at Fredonia.
Yeah, I wonder who's responsible for that. That's a good question. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. I need you to hang on for just a minute, just so that your videos upload.